Fake money greetings for the BS, Black Struggles YouTube channel. Welcome to BS, Black Struggles. Globe Fire. This is where we share, listen and get inspired by challenging journeys. Get stronger through every difficulty. Rise from hardship. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to create a sustainable community together. Let's rise together. Raised fist medium dark skin tone sparkles. Would you like to add any specific details or messages? Racist cop stops black man, then realizes is the head of internal affairs. YouTube transcript. When a routine traffic stop becomes a career-defining moment, a cop's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. The man he stopped holds his future in the Sioux. As he approached a yellow light, he slowed just as it turned red. That's when the flashing blue and red lights erupted behind him, followed by the sharp wail of a police siren. Tony glanced at the rearview mirror. His brow slightly furrowed. He pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window as a patrol car stopped behind him. Stepping out of the police vehicle was Officer Mai, a man in his 30s with a crisp, short haircut and a gleaming badge on his chest. Adjusting his belt as he walked toward Tony's car, he carried the confidence of someone used to being in control. License and registration, Mai said. His tone was clipped, but Tony complied without a word, reaching into the glove compartment for his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were deliberate and calm, but he could feel Mai's eyes scanning him, as if searching for a reason to. Do you know why I pulled you over? Mai asked, leaning slightly toward TH. I'm not entirely sure, Tony replied evenly, his tone polite. You didn't come to a complete stop at the red light, Mai said, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice. Tony frowned slightly but gave a small nod. I see, I thought I had slowed down in time. But I understand. Mai didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, squinting as he studied Tony more closely. This was no longer just a routine traffic stop, at least not for Mai. His posture shifted subtly but noticeably, as if he had decided this was more tar. The officer glanced at the license in his hand. You're not from around here, are you? Tony hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. I moved here a few months ago. My address is on my Lee. But Mai wasn't really listening. His questions grew sharper, his focus shifting away from the traffic violation. The calmness in Tony's demeanor seemed to unsettle him, and he leaned in closer. Where are you? Just heading home, Tony replied, his tone still steady, but the subtle shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Mai no longer saw Tony as just another driver. He saw something else, something suspicious. Tony could feel the tension rising, but he remained composed. What Mai didn't know was that Tony's calmness wasn't ignorance, it was control. This was only the beginning. Mai stepped back, folding Tony's documents at an exaggeratedly slow pace before tucking them into his chest pocket. Straightening up, his expression shifted into something slightly smug, as if he had already decided what kind of man sat before him. Step out of the car, Mai ordered. Tony gripped the steering wheel for a brief moment, but his face remained unreadable. Quote, Mai's, the unspoken threat. Tony was slightly taller than the officer, his broad shoulders adding to his composed presence. His tailored suit hinted at a level of refinement and authority that didn't fit Mai's expectations. About professionalism, his polished shoes hinted at a meticulous and careful man, but none of that seemed to matter. Mai gestured forward, hands where I can see them. Eric followed his movements, calm and cautious. Is there something specific you're looking for, officer? Mai offered a weak smile. Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful. Tony turned his head, locking eyes with Mai. Incidents involving men in suits driving cars? Or is this about something else? The question landed like a punch. And for a moment, Larson's composure wavered. He straightened up, his hand drifting toward his belt, more reflex than necessity. Watch your tone, he said, his voice hardening. I'm just asking a question, Tony replied, his voice steady, devoid of any challenge, just quiet resolve. The reaction seemed to unsettle the officer. Larson leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. You seem very familiar with how this works. Got something to hide? Tony let the silence stretch for a beat before answering. No, officer, I just believe in understanding the reasons behind an interaction like this. Transparency. You know? Mai scoffed but didn't reply. He stepped back, pacing in a small circle near the car. The dynamic was shifting in a way he couldn't quite grasp. Tony wasn't reacting the way most people would, no fear, no stammering, no nervous fidgeting. Instead, he was unnervingly calm, in control, and that made Mai tense. You seem pretty confident, Larson murmured, almost to himself, as if he thought he knew how this would play out. Tony didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer, respect is. Mai stiffened for half a second before turning to face him again. The smirk was gone, replaced by something sharper, almost offensive. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. Tony's composure was throwing him off. And he didn't like that. As the silence stretched, the tension between them felt electric. And Mike started to realize that this wasn't going to go the way he had expected. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. He tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration barely concealed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Tony. His gaze flicked back to the car, as if searching for a justification he hadn't yet thought of. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood," Mike ordered, his voice cutting through the air. "I need to check for weapons." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, his tone incredulous but still calm. "Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" Mike's jaw clenched, and for a brief second, his composure cracked. "I won't ask you again." Tony hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat on the hood. Mike stepped forward, the crunch of gravel under his boots breaking the uncomfortable silence. His hands patted Tony down in quick, rough movements, lingering longer than necessary. This wasn't just a search. It was an assertion of dominance. An attempt to provoke a reaction. But Tony didn't flinch, didn't tense, didn't even shift under the invasive scrutiny. "He's clean," Mike muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded reluctant, like it annoyed him that he had found nothing to justify his suspicion. Tony turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Of course I'm clean," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Mike interrupted, his voice rising slightly, words spilling out too quickly, betraying his need to be in control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Tony crossed his arms, his posture relaxed despite the tension crackling between them. "I've had quite a few interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Mike's eyes narrowed. "So, what are you, a lawyer or something?" Tony offered a small, almost amused smile. "Or something." The vagueness of his answer only irritated Mike further. The officer stepped closer, invading Tony's space, his voice dropping into a near growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? You think you can talk your way out of this?" Tony met his gaze steadily, unwavering. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I haven't seen much of that here." The words hung in the air like a challenge. And Mike took the bait. "Fairness? You think this is about fairness?" Mike scoffed. "Guys like you always." He stopped short, the words still lingering like smoke, though they hadn't fully escaped. Tony's expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted, a subtle but unmistakable signal that he understood exactly what Larson had just left unsaid. "Guys like me?" Tony repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Mike flinched, stepping back as if realizing he had crossed a line he couldn't talk his way out of. "You know what I mean," he muttered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. "I think I do," Tony replied smoothly, his calm no longer passive but razor-sharp, cutting through the pretense like a blade. "And I think we both know that this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Mike opened his mouth to argue but, for the first time, couldn't find the words. He didn't look sure of himself anymore, as if he wasn't entirely certain how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, Mike felt uneasy, but the moment of reckoning had yet to come, and it would be a moment he would never forget. Tony's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "I think it's time you knew who I am, officer." Mike's brows furrowed, his irritation flaring back up. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though the slight tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Tony reached into his pocket, slow, deliberate, careful. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said evenly, watching Mike's hand twitch near his holster. "No theatrics. I just want you to see." The words hung in the air, waiting. Mike's eyes followed Tony's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "Tony Porter," Tony said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Director, Sacramento Internal Affairs." Mike went rigid, his eyes flicking from the badge back to Tony's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Tony's expression, only quiet authority, and a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Mike echoed, his voice slightly hoarse. "You." Tony cut him off before he could finish. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that those who wear this badge uphold the integrity and values it represents." Mike's face paled, his once confident demeanor cracked in real time. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his belt as if the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too heavy. Tony stepped forward, closing the distance Mike had instinctively created. Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction is? Officer? He asked, his voice calm but sharp. I didn't answer. He looked like a man realizing he had stepped into quicksand with no way out. It's not the profiling, Tony continued, though that's bad enough. It's not even the unwarranted escalation. It's the fact that you did all of this without even knowing who you were talking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you swore to uphold. And why? I opened his mouth but said nothing. Because I don't fit your idea of someone worthy of respect. Tony finished for him. His words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of an indictment. And that's not just a problem for me, officer, that's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. Step back, give me a little time to breathe. But his voice does not lose its sharpness. This is what's going to happen, he said. I will take a step back, return my documents, and think carefully about what you're going to say next. My's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly debating whether to push back or comply. The hesitation made him lose credibility. Then, Tony spoke again, his voice lowering slightly. You will hear me again, not as a driver pulling over to the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you are fit to wear that badge. My swallowed hard, his face flushing as the weight of the moment sank in. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out his license and badge number, his hand trembling slightly as he handed them over. Tony took them silently, slipping them into his wallet. Walking toward the driver's side door, Tony paused, one hand on the handle. He looked over his shoulder, meeting my eyes one last time. Remember this, Officer Larson, Tony said. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone, it makes you accountable to everyone. As Tony slid back into his car and started the engine, I stood there in the fading light, his confidence shaken, his future uncertain. But for Tony, this was far from over. His next move would send ripples through the entire police department. The drive home was quiet, but Tony's mind was anything but. The encounter replayed in his head, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Tony had to deal with like this. And he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Tony had the authority to act. The next morning, Tony sat at his desk, the morning sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department. Internal Affairs Division. An open file lay before him. Officer Bradley Mai. His record wasn't spotless, minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, stopping people too frequently, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Tony leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled as he considered the broader implications. Mai wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of a deeper issue, and Tony had no interest in patching bullet wounds with band-aids. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in, holding a stack of morning reports. Mr. Porter, I have the summary from last month's violations, she said. Also, Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about the department's evaluation next week. Tony nodded, taking the file from her. Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him. Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Tony's tone. Of course, she said before slipping out of the room. Tony turned his attention back to Mai's file. But he wasn't just focusing on this one officer. This was bigger than one man and one interaction. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Mai to feel justified in his behavior. And if there was one thing Tony knew, it was that culture starts at the top. That afternoon, Tony sat across from Chief Daniels in the conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with graying hair and a serious demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Tony recounted the traffic stop. I could chalk it up as just another bad interaction, Tony said, his voice steady but firm. But that would be a mistake. Mai's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, it's a reflection of the work we still need to do. Daniels rubbed his temple, exhaling slowly. This isn't the first time Mai's name has come up, he admitted, but we've always handled these issues quietly. And that's the problem, Tony responded. Silence doesn't fix anything, silence lets it continue. It's time to speak up. Daniels studied him, the weight of the conversation etched into his face. What are you proposing? A full departmental review, Tony said without hesitation, not just on individual officers but on our training programs, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us? Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. You're going to ruffle some feathers with this. Tony simply replied, it's about time someone did. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Tony worked tirelessly, compiling data. Mai had become the catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Mai, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Tony made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Mai throughout the proceedings, watching as the officer squirmed under scrutiny. The hearing led to a suspension, but Tony knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Mai, it was in preventing the next Mai. Months later, Tony stood at the podium at a community event, speaking to a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. He didn't speak about blame, he spoke about responsibility, about the shared duty to build a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for accountability, they were a promise of change. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, Tony said, his voice echoing through the hall. It's about ensuring that those who have sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for every person they encounter. That is the badge I believe in. And that is the badge we are building together. Applause erupted, but Tony didn't linger. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As he stepped down from the podium, he scanned the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. If this story resonates with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Start the important conversations, the ones that lead to real change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we fight for what's right.